Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network 𝐀𝐬𝐻𝐿. I'm Asbed Bedrosyan. In this Conversations on 𝐀𝐬𝐻 episode, we'll be talking about the importance of policy research in shaping and implementing policies in a global context as well as the context of Armenia. Our host for this discussion is Dr. Asbed 𝐀𝐬𝐿, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at the American University of Armenia, where he teaches courses on post-Soviet space and the Middle East. This episode was recorded on Saturday, January 2nd, 2021.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Policy is a set of proposals developed and then implemented by governments to address an issue or a problem in the society. The spheres that policy has an impact on ranges from health and social policies, usually categorized as public policy, to foreign and sometimes even military policies. To develop relevant and useful public policies, policy research and analysis is a key component, and some would argue that it is the foundation of any policy development. As an academic field, public policy relies on several disciplines such as economics, political science, sociology, behavioral science, health, management, and others, resulting in an interdisciplinary field reflecting interconnected public issues. We will be discussing these issues today not just as an abstraction, but also as it relates to public policy making in Armenia. To talk about these issues, we are joined by Arevik Anapiosyan, who is the Partnerships and Development Finance Advisor to the UN Resident Coordinator in Armenia. Previously, she served as a Deputy Minister of Education, Science and Culture and Sports of the Republic of Armenia. Prior to joining the government, she was the Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute of Public Policy, very much relevant to our today's discussion, which is a think tank and was one of the first education profile institutions to study policy, concerns, and challenges in Armenia. Arevik holds an MA degree in political science as well as in international affairs, and she did her studies towards PhD in international law and conflict resolution. Currently, she's studying at the General Management Program of the Harvard Business School. For the past 13 years, Arevik has been actively involved in policy research and advocacy in Armenia and regionally, and she has been teaching courses in those subjects as well. Arevik, welcome.
Thank you, Asbed.
Let's start the discussion and the conversation today by first looking at a meta or conceptual level of what is public policy. So healthy and relevant public policies are those that rely on data collection, informed and expert opinion, as well as open communication between policy analysts, experts, and policy makers. Could you provide an overview of the different methods of policy making, data-driven, evidence-based, user-centered, and others?
Well, thank you for posing this question in this way. I believe what we're trying to discuss today is how the decision-making process towards the policy implementation starts with. But I want to go one step back and maybe conceptually design or try to describe a little bit of what types of policies are there. And your introduction interestingly mentioned what is public policy in general. Along the years that I was teaching this subject at Yerevan State University, I came across an interesting explanation by Harold Lasswell that says, politics is the process by which society determines who gets what, when they get it, and how they get it. On top of it is also an interesting explanation saying that it's also a decision of what the government chooses to do and chooses not to do. And in this typology, one of the descriptions that I find relevant is that there are three types of policies, if we can say. It's the distributive policy, the redistributive policy, and regulatory policy that usually the governments follow. So we know that in distributive policies, there's very little scrutiny and it's a small group that is getting the benefits of the decisions that government is taking. In the redistributive policies, there is a lot of debate on which interest group, which beneficiary group is mainly receiving the impact or outputs of the policy decisions. And finally, it's the regulatory types of policies that go either, there are two ways. One way is the competitive regulatory policies and then the protective regulatory policies. It's usually with the competitive regulatory policies, it's the provision of goods and services to one or a few designated beneficiaries who are being chosen from a larger number of competing potential beneficiaries. And then usually in this case, there is a lot of debate in a public space on what gets into the policy agenda, if we can say so.
The issue of the law of unintended consequences, does this fall in any way in this policy analysis and policy sort of adjustment, in a sense that you come up with a law, you implement it, but then you realize that the law is not being used or the policy is not being implemented or used the way it was supposed to be used?
If we look into the regulatory policies, well, all types of policies ideally should have data at its core, and they should have analysis of the data at its core. And when I say this, it implies that also there is analysis of what the impact of a given policy is going to be. We know that the utmost manifestation of where the policies are being codified, it's the laws. It starts with the Constitution, that goes into the normative regulatory framework. It's very difficult to say that one can come up with a policy decision that all of the consequences are well designed and well thought of. Usually it's the lack of proper research that is impeding these types of policies. And when we also come into the decision making, we think that the best way of making those policy decisions should be based on the rational, comprehensive decision making models or the cost benefit analysis. But we see that oftentimes all the policies, or at least the decisions on how the policy and what policy gets into the policy agenda out of the universe of the possible issues, there is a lot of value at the core, value judgment at the core of these decisions. And not necessarily, it implies that this value judgment is not based on the data and analysis, but we see that with the lack of data analysis, the values prevail, and it could be very much arbitrary.
Data analysis also assumes public opinion, right? Public opinion is data. However, it's unreliable and it's very subjective. Noam Chomsky has declared in 2006 that there is a tremendous gap between public policy and public opinion. Is it possible to rely on public opinion as a set of data that policymakers can use to develop a certain policy to address what the public is expressing about a gap or an issue that needs to be addressed?
You know, Aspat, I think this reminds me of a research that Rand Corporation did back in 2008. It's a book actually published called Truth Decay, and it was a very interesting analysis of how opinions these days prevail facts and data, and that the lines between the opinion and facts have become very blurred. And then one of the main drivers of why this truth decay happens is the cognitive biases. So we see that the rise of social media, access to social media, the unfiltered information that is out there, and inability to personally filter, to have media literacy on what is the fact, what is data, and what is opinion, we all end up in a situation that there is a lot of prevalence of opinions over facts and data. And it requires certain training to speak with data. The data is out there, and we do not speak the data if we're unable to analyze. And this is the area where we need education to step in. And I believe that formal education has a tremendous role to play in that. But
what about context? The context matters, right? You can look at the same set of data as I would, and we can go on diverging paths of analysis.
Absolutely. And that's why the most dangerous feature is that data can be easily manipulated. Oftentimes That's true. Oftentimes there is this perception that there is a difference between academic research and policy research. Well, the truth is that there is one scientific method to be applied, but the end goals of why the data is being used is very much manipulated. And the less media literate the society is, the more are the possibilities to manipulate the public.
What do you mean by media literate, Arevik?
It's very simple. When you listen to a fact, or when you listen to a video, or you read a news and you do not double check the source, whether the provider is a reliable source to trust in. You know, one of the things that I think is important to consider, maybe 30 years ago, there were a couple of sources of information. There were the formal education maybe newspaper, and then the newspaper would double check the facts and you would know it's something out there in the newspaper, you would trust it. These days, Twitter is becoming the key driver of the news provision, and we cannot know what is true there, what is not, what is data-driven, what is just arbitrary, if we do not have the skills to double-check. And we see that very much in the Armenian context as well, not just around the world, but in Armenia as well.
Right. Well, one of the things is that in that context of media literacy, it's also about media awareness. And today, with the media out there, voices, audio sources or even video sources can be manipulated. It becomes, almost schizophrenic to rely on any news source, and you can rely on all the traditional ones, but they're becoming less and less relevant, aren't they?
That's the problem. That's the problem with the traditional sources. So you're in academia, you know that to do a research the way that we perceive is the right way, with the right methodology, the pilot, etc., it takes minimum a year to produce a quality research and then come up with recommendations. This past year in 2020, we saw that with COVID, it was impossible to wait for a year to do some predictions. So you had to have the systems that are agile enough to adapt to the reality, probably to some extent compromise the comprehensive methodology toolkits, but come up with reliable research data and analysis. So I am also at the board of the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, and we were discussing during the board meeting how difficult it has been for the institution to come up with solutions to produce data worldwide that could be quick enough, reliable enough, at the same time not require the rigorous research body that usually we would expect for this type of an institute to come up with. So I think one of the drawbacks, one of the shortcomings of the so-called traditional thing is that it's very slow. How can we come up with the methods? How can we come up with the solutions to ensure the agility of those institutions, to agility maybe come up with new research methods that would be equally reliable, but not take that much long? Wouldn't you think? I mean, you're in an academia, you've done your research yourself a number of times.
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it depends also on the type of academic research, right? Is it qualitative or quantitative research? Are you using data to form a theory and hypotheses, or are you relying on sole interviews? That is itself, as long as at the beginning you do mention, in academic research, you have the advantage of saying, this research is based on interviews. And yes, we know that interviews are biased because you're dealing with people. People lie, period. So, but then when it comes to quantitative analysis, obviously, it has become more and more of a mathematical models of explaining things. I think there's a disconnect. You can't have one without the other. You cannot have quantitative research without the qualitative research. But for policy purposes, I think the only way to go is data-driven analysis or data-driven policy making.
Which governments oftentimes say that they don't have time for that. They would require
the budget.
That's also true. But if even in the fast-moving world, we see that the governments would like to have some data, analysis of that data in a very short period of time. When we ask the government, okay, when do you want this to be done? They say yesterday. So this is also another challenge for the field.
There's that disconnect between, governments wanting to get things done, even genuinely, and their inability or being hostages to their preconceptions and existing institutions to be able to take that extra measures or newer models for a more efficient data analysis.
I think it also depends on where the governments stand. And what gets into the policy agenda, what remains, say, in the institutional agenda and the decision-making agenda, which is a smaller one, get very few things. And this is the place where the prioritization of the policies is very much based on the values, on the beliefs that the given government follows. And with the absence of quality research, first of all, data could be easily skewed. And then they start relying on their values, on their perceptions, and also try to manipulate the existing small amount of anecdotal evidence to convince the general public that whatever they're doing is for the benefit of the greater public.
Now, when it comes to critical thinking and analysis, it's a field that is usually taught, and in universities, at least in the West and in different universities around the world. But can media literacy be applied, or can it be taught at schools and at universities, even at a basic level? I'm not talking about journalists only, but as a gen ed course
Sure.
that everyone has to take.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, in critical thinking, there are two schools. One thinks that critical thinking can be taught. Others believe that it is the byproduct. I am leaning towards the second version, that you do not teach critical thinking. You provide the teaching and learning methodology, absolutely. And then the critical thinking is the natural byproduct of the educational teaching and learning processes. And you do not start it at the universities by far. You start it at the very early ages of the school, of the K-12 education. Unlike critical thinking, media literacy can be taught. So there are certain tools that the learners could be provided with so that they can double check that at least like the standard operation procedure type of thing of what you need to do when you come up with a piece of information, how you double check it. That can be taught. And again, I don't believe that the higher education is the right place. It's the last resort. If it hasn't been taught at the K-12 level, then it goes to the higher education. At K-12 level, that's absolutely important to give the learners the key methodological tools. And this is not a mission that has been accomplished around the world, but I think that more and more educational and educational systems have given a very thorough thought how to incorporate that into their curricula.
Right. Okay, moving on to Armenia. In the past decade or so, as you have, I have had many opportunities to observe and contribute to public policy debate and research in Armenia in various spheres, be that in societal, judicial, security. And every time I did that, the old saying that making laws is like making sausages. No one wants to see how they are made. It's a complete mess. What has your experience been like in terms of what we talked about conceptually, from looking from outside in, observing the policymaking process in Armenia in the last decade or so?
So I think I have two perspectives. Maybe third have been added up with me joining the UN Armenia here. My first perspective was from the civil society, from an think tank perspective. So
right.
We would work with the Ministry of Education on those days, and the changes that we would provide or the recommendations that we would come up with, they would be incremental and possibly requiring systemic changes, but not entirely reforming the system. And in those small incremental things, there was a possibility to work with the government, with the ministry. I would say that even then, I noticed that there is no interconnectedness of various policies at the government level, because there is no interdisciplinary approach to solving the problems that were prevailing in the policy agenda. When I joined the government, my worst fears got proven to be true, which is that we very much lacked comprehensive decision-making. We couldn't see that interconnectedness between the policy issues and the lack of channels of communication between the various agencies and agents. We ended up with the policy decisions that were good for a very short period of time, but in a long run perspective, that would come up still, that would yield a number of problems. And I think it also has to do, and I want to really stress it out here, it also has to do on what's the budget distribution. So we very oftentimes forget that the most important policy document of the country is the budget. And the budget you have, so in Armenia we have the policies that the law requires us to implement. So you have to allocate certain amounts to that. The second sector of the budget goes to those projects that are continuing from the previous years. And finally, very small portion being allocated for new policies, for new decisions. And the whole argument, the whole fight of who gets what and when goes around this third section. And the reason that there is no proper interconnectedness, and because of lack of that interconnectedness, we end up with abstracted decisions that, if well thought through, could possibly yield an impact of a scale. And I want to give you one example, if I may.
I was going to ask for a concrete example. Yes, please.
Yes. So from my experience, we started to, what I initiated when I was at the ministry, we started to design 22 schools in the villages that the only school in that village would be in a very poor condition and had less than 100 students. So obviously these schools would become the shining stones in those areas. But of course, it would also be amazing if we could have the children from other villages to come and study in these schools. So really, out of a very personal initiative, I called my colleague in the Ministry of Territorial Administration and asked whether or not they could incorporate the renovation of the roads of that particular village linking to the other villages, so that once the schools are in place, we can have the roads in good condition, so that we could have a bus that could take children from the bordering villages to this school. But the problem is that it would take an individual to maybe have that idea or not have the idea, and then come up with this comprehensiveness. I'm very much fearing that in our country for the past 30 years, we have failed developing such standards that would say what should be done in a given condition, in a given situation, so that it wouldn't very much hinge on a single person or individual, or a professionalism of a single person, or lack of professionalism of a single person. So we're very much lacking properly established institutions other than what we had during Soviet times.
But other than the institutions themselves, there's also the issue that you mentioned about the interconnectedness and the cooperation context. And we see this a lot in the post-Soviet space, there, where each person or each ministry would look at their sort of domain, their ministry, let's say, if they're a minister, as their fiefdom. And rather, they would see other ministries as competing over budget. I mean, you see this in the United States as well, right? Whenever there's a budget, the various agencies compete for getting more and more budget, usually at the expense of another. Well, is it an issue of culture? Is it an issue of structure? Is it an issue of mentality that could bypass this?
I would probably leave out mentality, because I don't believe that if we had the institutions in place, mentality would have much to do with it. But I think that a little bit of all the others that you've mentioned. So if we're talking about a systemic approach, first of all, we need to have systemic thinking, which we are circling back towards the educational system, but the education is not providing systemic thinking to its graduates, who later on employ the public and private sector. Then on the other hand, I don't think that we have a shortage of bright ideas, but we definitely lack policy engineers. It's great to have these big ideas of what has to be done, what can be done, but at the stage of policy engineering, we see that those who had the great ideas, they say, okay, I had the idea, now you go and engineer it. So, and in the government sector especially, maybe there could be just a handful of professionals who have the skills, others are lacking, and in the absence of the systems in place, obviously, we end up with great ideas who are not thoroughly engineered. And it is true for all the sectors, from education to healthcare, defense, environment. And this is, I think that the absence of the truly developed think tank community, which has to yield from the academia, I'm thinking.
Right.
We will definitely continue experiencing this half-designed policies that are not fully engineered till the end, and the impact is not also calculated. And the unintended consequences, the one that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, are always going to be in place if we fail designing the reform, designing the policy till the very end. And we don't do that. We've witnessed that we're not doing it.
Yeah, but also there is an element of lacking a groupthink, right? Groupthink can be a positive and a negative thing. I mean, there is a groupthink that resists cooperation, that resists sort of policy engineering, but you can also change the groupthink by developing those.
What do you imply with groupthink?
Well, in behavioral science, they look at groupthink as a way that organizational culture, for instance, would be groupthink. And in this case, government culture or governing culture, bureaucracy culture, the culture of bureaucracy, and so on.
Well, I think that in the case of Armenia, we have a weird situation. We didn't have the system in place, and I dare say corruption was the system, was the mechanism that was running the system. With the current government in place that aimed at marginalizing, at least marginalizing corruption, and not having another mechanism in place that would run the system, we end up in a space that we have neither nor, and a lot of decisions depends on the discretion of the people who are in charge of those decision making.
Individualism, yeah.
Absolutely, and I see that one of the problems is that we were not very much successful in designing a replacement for those institutions. Let's call it institutions, whatever, or bureaucracy or mechanisms. We didn't design the replacement of those that the government aimed at eliminating or marginalizing. And we ended up in a situation that a problem would get solved only if you could have an access to the top decision maker.
In this case, the prime minister.
On that particular issue, it could be, if the issue is big, then yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Arevik, you did mention that the need for policy engineers, it stems from academia. The question is, where can you recruit those policy engineers? Do you have a dedicated policy analysis and policy research, public policy research in Armenia? I know in the United States, public policy is witnessing a revival. A lot of schools, actually, this is the most hired job market in the United States, public policy in general, health policy included, especially with COVID-19 and so on. Where do you generate that in Armenia? Where do you recruit people in Armenia?
Aspet, I don't trust in in having an academic program in policymaking that will be a solution to all of the policies. I more trust in research methodologies, in research analysis courses that are introduced in basically all of the academic programs. And we know that, unfortunately, the higher education has not really changed, has not been very much reformed for the past maybe 10 years. And even with the accreditation system and everything being introduced, we know that it's the American University of Armenia that has a course on research methods, and then there's the Department of Sociology, the only one at the Yerevan State University that teaches some kind of research methodology, but without having these tools, without equipping the students with the tools, how they can do basic research, I don't believe it is possible to have the professionals who could later on be recruited or be involved or establish themselves these think tanks. I'm more keen to think that, well, first of all, there has to be, the best way is to have a combination of the local, very preferably diaspora professionals who could also be practitioners, who could come and teach at the Armenian universities, who could be joining their efforts in establishing institutions, preferably adjunct to the academic communities, enabling also students at very early ages to get involved in some of the research and analysis to be conducted in this country. And finally, I am really thinking that this detachment of the teaching universities, which most of our universities are, and research institutions, is one of the greatest evils that our country educational system of the country has. Once we manage to join them in in a very delicate manner and provide a platform that could be neither purely think tank nor purely academia, then we can have a possibility of having some quality policy research. But I'm thinking that at this stage, what I have observed, and I'm being very frank here, I don't see that during the past 30 years, I should say, including this government, there has been very much willingness to follow the recommendations of the research institutions. Maybe we didn't have research institutions fully equipped to do that, but even the individual researchers, they would come up with some recommendations. This would not be gladly taken. And I believe that there has to be certain trust developed in the country towards research, and of course bearing in mind that a lot of times data is being manipulated all over the world, and how we can really contribute to Armenian policymaking in the first place, and then move to a larger scales, possibly on employing more data-driven policy that wouldn't have this cognitive biases, I think.
Yeah, Arevik, it takes two to tango, right? Or sometimes more, depending on the dance. But in this case, there are two elements here. One is the production of policy research, as limited as it is by research institutions, but also on the other hand, it's the ability or the willingness of government and agencies to accept or to view those as something that can be useful rather than be dismissed as coming out of, all those academics there in their ivory towers. What is the challenge here? Are there any examples where there had been data-driven research on policy that has been produced and have been ignored or have been accepted, even if it's sort of anecdotal cases?
I think you're absolutely right that at this point we have some type of an arrogance from the decision makers from the decision makers that they do not trust the research on what has to be done, and we can take it also in the economic policy, on taxation, how the recent taxation reform should be taken forward. There was a research, there have been a number of analyses how it is going to impact the overall fiscal policy, but it was not very much taken and considered by the decision makers. But it's not just that. I think that the decision makers and also some of the policy researchers, I wouldn't like to say institutions, because we have a very weird landscape at this stage in our history. They're also very much detached from the public. I wouldn't say that the public knows it all, but also ignorance of what's the will of the public, what are their problems, and belief that the decision makers know the best what the public fears, what problems public has brought us to a situation that there is a more and more gap between the genuine problems that the people are facing and then the recommendations and policy, the research recommendations and policy decisions on the other hand that are being adopted these days.
So it's a sort of a tripartite problem. You have the public opinion no one listens to. You do not have data research or very limited data research, and then you have policymakers, decision makers ignoring it. So there is no link in between these, and it goes back to what Chomsky is saying. Not only there is a difference between a gap between public opinion and public policy, but also there is a gap between public policy and data-driven public policy research.
Yes, that triangle has a lot to do, but at some point also the decisions that are purely based on public opinion might not really yield the best policy outcomes. We know that the one thing for sure about the public, that the public is resistant to change, and making the decisions that would increase the credibility of the government and the public opinion polls would probably not be the most advanced looking, most reforming to the benefit of the public in the long run decisions. So while taking public opinion into account is very much important, I believe that in Armenia we also need to be mindful of the bias that the citizens might have towards in making up their opinions and making up their their ideas towards this or that policy outcomes. And I'll give you an example from the field that I know best of. It's the field of education reform. One thing we know for sure is that the change of education happens in the classroom, not in the papers. And the classroom is the teaching and learning methodology where the teacher is the key, is the most important factor. And at the same time, we know that teachers are very much resistant to change because it's a normal human behavior to be resistant to change, to the unknown. So taking into account the teachers' fears would yield in not changing anything in the world, including in Armenia at all. But it's important to listen to the fears and address those risks in the policy making. That's why public opinion is important, not for basing the policies, but for knowing what the risks could be in case of policy implementation.
Right. Yeah, like everywhere else, policymakers and data analysts and so on, they usually assume what the people think rather than having a listening tour and listen to what people say. And more often than not, it ends up being in a way that if I need your opinion, I'll give it to you kind of a situation. And that is problematic, I think, to some of the issues that you mentioned. So one final note, Arevik, how do you see bridging this sort of gap that exists in the issues that you mentioned between policy research and policy making, and how can you create a critical mass, enough of a critical mass that this can be accepted by everyone?
Aspat, you have the $1 million question. This is the $1 million question, but I'll try maybe to share some of my thoughts. So we're not talking theoretically, we're probably talking very practically about Armenia. And we know that the society, the political sphere as well, is very much stratified. And I think that the most important first steps is to really try to identify the fears that currently the society has. And after that, this probably could be followed by addressing some of those fears in the best possible manner. The question here would be, what is the best platform for doing that? And I think that my thinking is that maybe the educational institutions still have remained more or less as the platforms where this critical mass could come together around the ideas. And if it is not already the space, then this academic institutions could become the space, the platform for thoughts, for ideas, and for also various professionals to work collectively together on such issues. Because of this polarization and stratification, I am very much mindful not to pinpoint anything other than what I would still trust to be relatively academically sound, which are the few higher education institutions that probably would also be pointed by some of the diaspora academia representatives as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Arevik. This has been quite an engaging, and we touched only the surface of the discussion. Thank you for your time and for your thoughts.
The pleasure is all mine.
Thank you, Arevik. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and join us next time on Conversations on Grung.
That concludes this Conversations on Grung episode. We hope it was helpful in your understanding of some of the issues involved. We look forward to your feedback, including your suggestions for conversation topics in the future. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.